Okay, in the last one we got down to this part, so we're going to scroll to where we talk about data type conversion and assignment, and switching between types on the fly. So most other languages require that you initialize the variable before using it, so you have to declare it and stuff, specifying what the type of data it is that it can hold. And thing is, PHP is less formal, and a lot of people actually don't like that. People who are like, old school programmers, they really don't care for that. It's called a loosely written language. If it does data type conversion on the fly, it's typically a loosely written language. Other people will be a little less generous and call it like a hack language, but whatever. You don't need to tell PHP which data type is in a variable, because PHP evaluates the data when you assign it, and it will basically try to pick the most appropriate type. It's normally quite helpful. PHP guesses the data type pretty accurately, but sometimes it's not helpful sometimes. And it doesn't mean that just because it can guess the data type, it doesn't mean that you're not allowed to specifically declare what the data type is. You can still do that. But anyway, and PHP will convert the data when it needs to be converted. Okay, so let's look at this example. So we've got a variable called integer variable, or integer var, okay, and we have it equal to the value of 1. All right, that would be stored as an integer because it's just the number 1. It doesn't have quotation marks around it. And then we have another one that we're declaring. It's called float variable, and its value is 1.1. It's stored as a float. And then what happens is if we were to make a new variable called sum variable, and we wanted to actually store the sum of these other two that we just created of integer var and float var, we could say sum variable equals integer variable plus, and this is a mathematical operator, float variable. What would happen is that it's going to have to add 1 to 1.1, and so it's going to convert the sum variable that we're creating here to a float, because the value ends up having to be 2.1 in the end, because 1 plus 1.1 is 2.1. And so it understands that this now needs to be a float variable. The other thing that it'll do as part of that process is that it'll actually say, oh, well, I have 1.1 and I have to add it to 1. It does the same thing that you had to do like as you were a kid when you were in arithmetic, where you'd have to say, oh, okay, well, I need 2 places, and so it would take this and it would say, okay, well, this is really 1.0, and let's add that to 1.1, and then you line up your columns, and that's kind of what PHP is doing for you, but, just a lot faster than you did it as a kid. Okay, so, but if it really matters what your data type is, and you need to check to make sure that something is a data type, or you need to tell it explicitly it needs to be a data type, then you can use what's called typecasting. And there are some different ways to do this, not just these ways, but I'm not going to go all into it. But this is one way that you can do typecasting. And so what we've got here is we're making a variable called integer var, and we're saying that it is equal to var1. But what we're doing is we're saying it has to be an integer, okay? So it's only going to work whenever it creates this as an integer, all right? So it's going to say, it's going to store this value, the integer value of var1, as the value of integer variable. Okay, same is true here, where we say we're going to make something called float var, and then we force variable 1, or var1, to be a float. So if our value was something like the number 6, okay, integer var would store the value of 6 as an integer here. In the second one, it would be 6.0, and in the third one, where it's a string, it would be in like something that you would represent in quotation marks. It'd be the string of the character 6. Okay, you have to think of it as a character. All right. So anyway, that's the way that works. and you can look at the rest of this, but it's basically the same as what we were talking about. All right, and you know that it would lose its decimal places if you were to force something into a different data type. So like for instance, if you have a float of 1.8 and you cast it as an integer, you're forcing it to lose that decimal. Okay, so all it'll do is it'll just drop the 0.8. It'll just drop it and it'll turn it into 1 instead of 1.8. It doesn't round it up. In fact, later when we get into numbers, you'll see that there are functions that we can pass things through to round up and down. But if you typecast it and it's 1.8, it'll just drop the 8 and it'll just take the whole number value. Okay, that's the basic ending of our data type overview. So I want you to go ahead and move on now and start doing your other practicing. I think the next thing is going to be to start practicing with strings.